So why don't we jump in and as people join, they can join as we go. So first of all, my name's Simon Maple. I'm the field CTO at Snyk. I've been at Snyk for almost 5 years now, and in the engineering space for the last 20. I kind of cut my teeth building middleware solutions at IBM, and been a DevRel community and now field CTO at Snyk. I would say that kind of part of my career has been around the last decade or so. This is going to be a session where we talk with our speaker Seb Coles, who we'll be introducing in just a second, and we're going to really be talking about how ClearBank have been adopting a new security practice, process, and tool with Snyk, and hopefully that we can share some great knowledge there. A little bit of background before we jump in. This is a recorded session, and we'll be sending this recording out to folks. So if you do miss something, no worries. You can always check out the recording. Feel free to add comments and questions in the chat, and we'll try and incorporate them as we go. So feel free to contribute and add as we go. There's also the Q&A. So if you prefer questions in the Q&A. Oh, in fact, the chat is disabled. Apologies for that. So feel free to add questions into the chat, and we'll absolutely try and cover those as well. So the Q&A panel is where you want to go for questions. I don't think anyone else can see those other than the organizers. So we'll absolutely cover those for you. Okay, so let's jump in. First of all, joining me from ClearBank is Seb Coles. So Seb, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, first of all, what you do, and a little bit about your background?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Simon. So my name's Seb. So I guess the usual way I introduce myself, I grew up in a place called Thurso. So Simon, have you ever been to Thurso on the very north of Scotland?
I've not been to Thurso. I've been to John O'Groats, and I've been to Edinburgh and Aberdeen and Glasgow.
Very close to John O'Groats. I would describe it as the other side of Mordor. Is how I would describe it. I mean, growing up, the closest cinema for me was Inverness, and that was 4 hours on the train each way.
Wow.
Right? So it's pretty crazy. So I grew up with computers, and I spent a lot of time learning about IT security through high school. A lot of the stuff that we teach devs now about cross-site scripting, SQL injection. Well, I'll be frank, the first time I touched a database was SQL injection, right? First JavaScript I wrote was cross-site scripting. But I guess as I grew up, I found I actually liked building solutions far more than breaking solutions. And that's how I started as an engineer. Went through uni. I've worked in a couple of different markets: oil and gas, print, defense. But I always found myself drawn back to security because I found that when I was part of those conversations between InfoSec and engineers, the whole conversation just went a lot more slicker. I could understand both sides of the party, and I really enjoyed that. And I really enjoyed the transformation aspect of what we do. We're asking developers to change how they work, to try and build secure products, and I love that. And that's what I do at ClearBank. So my role at ClearBank, I'm an engineering manager for security engineering. The bottom line, my job is to try and reduce the risk of our software being used as an attack vector for cybercrime. But how we do that? Well, it's all about people, tools, process. How do we work in a way to build secure products? Shall I talk a bit about ClearBank as well?
Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about what it is that you do and how it's different.
Yeah, for sure. So ClearBank, so I think we're about 6 or 7 years old, and we're a bank fundamentally. We're a cloud bank, cloud native platform. So best way to describe it: when you log into online banking, okay, and you want to send some money to somebody that you know, you're behind the scenes, you're using payment schemes. That's how we move money around the UK. So for a small amount of money, be using something like faster payments. If you're setting up a direct debit, for example, you would start to use a different payment scheme known as BACS. And each of these schemes, they've got their own rules, rules to integrate, rules to how those messages handle each other. And to be frank, integrating with something like Swift, that's a lot of hard work. Okay, and really what ClearBank provided, the first service that ClearBank provided was, let's build some nice cloud platform, nice APIs, nice developer experience, and we can enable other banks to move their money around. And that's kind of our agency banking product. These banks, they're banking on their own license, but we do the legwork, right? We move the money around. But there's the second kind of bigger product that ClearBank, and really what I think is really cool is more our kind of embedded finance and our what you could call banking as a service. So we enable customers like Tide or Chip to not necessarily have to need a full light backing license. We can offer that as a service. So some very cool stuff. Behind the scenes, that's, we're talking microservices. I mean, my view of that world, or really it's about 500 deployable things. 120 of those are my customers, the dev teams, supported by another 80 technology professionals, BAs and product owners. And we're a tech company growing very, very quickly. How's that? Hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour of what ClearBank's about.
Yeah, very interesting. And it's interesting, in the fintech space there, to have lots of others building on top of you, and it presumably provides a lot of challenges, additional challenges there as well. Governance, regulations, compliance. Presumably you have a lot of things that you need to stay in check with there as well. So that's interesting to hear. So we'll talk a little bit post and pre, when you started using Snyk, but I'd love to understand a little bit more depth about some of the problem areas or your goals that you had, your objectives that you had before you started using Snyk. What were the things that you wanted to be able to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I arrived at ClearBank, some of our SDLC controls, really the critical control was a manual security review. So ClearBank was really hot on stuff like pipelines and infrastructure as code. We had the pull request processes in place, but every single pull request needed a manual review by a group of people known as security champions. And taking a look at that, it's not particularly scalable. We were going through a growth spurt where you're onboarding tens of engineers every week. The amount of software I'm to look at is getting bigger. The consistency of those reviews, it really depended on the experience of the reviewer as to how, I guess, thorough your security review was. And I guess one of the behaviors we were seeing is that the more experienced you were, the longer they were taking. And really, we wanted to solve that. It's like, how could we bring in a tool such as Snyk, a static analysis and SCA tooling that would enable us to move away from this manual reviewer, to have something that scaled, was consistent, couldn't be influenced by peer pressure, but was fast, right? Was be able to provide fast feedback, a good developer experience. So that's where we were when we came to the table wanting a SaaS tool.
Yeah, and so presumably, at least the bottleneck wasn't in the security space, in the sense, before we built up security champions programs and things like that, it very much used to kind of sometimes lie. If you want to do a manual check like that, it sometimes lay within the security team, and the security team would need to sign off something like that. But it's better than a lot of situations that we see people in. At least there's an engineer, and you presumably have one engineer per team that was a security champion. That would then perform that. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. But we could do better. So like my background, I've worked with a lot of these kind of tools, like checkmarks and Verity. I've worked for Veracode myself. I knew that a tool like this was the way to go for ClearBank. Getting the automation in there, and I guess not just finding the flaws, but working with a partner such as Snyk, being able to provide that feedback. I knew from the get-go, we're going to bring a tool in which we would need to support, but suddenly we're probably going to be finding a lot of issues. How do we automate some of that feedback? How do we make sure that the developers are able to self-serve their way through the flaws that they're finding? Again, more criteria for the kind of tool we were looking for.
Yeah, and I guess what the kind of, in a tool agnostic way, what are the kind of things that you actually wanted to change? So you mentioned automation, and I think consistency as well. We'll be talking about, not just having someone who's trying to review one of their mates or someone who sat next to them's code, but consistency depending on who the reviewer is and who the submitter is, but also consistency across all security champions. Were there any other things that you wanted to kind of like change or achieve with a potential new solution?
So visibility in the estate, right? When you're an infosec team, you've got all these repos, all those bits of software out there. It can be quite hard to find what I call a pulse check, some kind of metric, some kind of measure on the estate. Risk is a really hard thing. It's very open to bias. But when you've got a tool such as these tools, it just gives you that pulse check. I've got this view of the estate, and I'm able to start prioritizing my effort, right? I've got a team of people. We all have more work than we can handle. Tooling like this, it helps us identify the weak areas. Those are the areas that we need to focus on as well. So getting visibility of the estate was certainly key.
Yeah, I think that's a really common and consistent thing that we hear a lot, actually, and it's a big risk as well is like not knowing what risk there is and where that risk is, how it's distributed across your organization, right? And so obviously, ClearBank, you mentioned there's a good number of developers at ClearBank today. I guess, how, from your point of view, what were your thoughts in terms of rolling a new solution, even whether it's a process change, a culture change, a tooling change? What was your strategy in terms of changing that culture and shifting into a kind of like a newer model of doing things, a more automated way? How did you feel was the best approach to going about seeing that change?
It's a great question. I myself have suffered a poor rollout of tools such as this. I think, and I'm sure people on the call have experienced it as well, where a tool has been thrown at you, that tool's not been looked after properly. So it was just suddenly a change to my workflow. No one's really explained it. So the one thing that I would say is, when you're doing a change like this, a workflow change to a vast number of people, you have to take into account the people challenge of that. It is a people change that you're trying to do. You are going to get resistance, right? That's because you're interfering with their way of working, right? It's not personal. It's not because they don't like the tool. It's because you're changing how they work. There will be resistance. There will be people who need a bit more guidance on that journey to adopting this tooling. So having, like, the number one thing is having a people strategy for your rollout. Now that usually involves a lot of comms, over communicating, especially in a remote working environment. You're going to have pockets of the business who only want to use Teams. You have pockets who only want to use Slack, pockets that only want to use email. You can't have like a single approach to communicating with your customers. It's a bit like marketing, really, isn't it? You've got to talk on the terms that your customers want to talk. So constantly over communicating early, building fan bases was another part of our strategy. Like, from the get-go, every single call we had with yourselves or with the other prospectors, we'd have devs on the call, right? They're part of the journey as well. We're trying to build up fans, get their feedback, make sure they're included in this change. And the other thing is that it was always going to take a bit of time. It wasn't a smash solution, try and get something in. We know this was going to take 3 to 12 months to get this properly embedded. We set that expectation with our management very early. It was going to be a journey and a bit of a change. But really coming back to your point, Simon, like, number one, you've got to have some empathy for your customers, right?
And I think recognize that your customers, your dev teams, what one wants, another one's going to argue with or disagree with, right? So having enough empathy that and being almost flexible enough to be able to say, okay, this is what you want. I understand that this is something different to what this team wants, and I understand that as well. And having that flexibility to deal with them differently and separately. Yeah, that sounds very, very interesting. So I guess in terms of it's great strategy, and I think it's very, very important that when we think about culture first, that is the right way of doing it. Because you're right, we can change process in an instant. You can change tooling, bring in tooling in an instant, but that's not going to change your culture. They support your culture, and it's most important to think about your culture first, and then apply a tool or a process that will support that, and almost like police it where needed, so that as your devs lean out of the process that they need to be working to, they get nudged back in, or they get told this is where you're going wrong, and this is what you can do to get back in policy or compliance or whatever. So in terms of the solution, if we move more now to a tools discussion, in terms of a solution that you needed to fix this, to help you solve this problem, or help you at least back you up with the culture changes that you're trying to make in place. What were some of the criteria that you used to decide upon a tool to help you do this?
Yeah, great question. And I hope some of this answer will help some of the people on the call, because this kind of process of choosing the right tool for your organization, this was our approach, and hopefully it might be useful for you. So really, we had a couple of hardline criteria, right? Did you support our technology? That's quite a basic one, right? We generally grade that on a scale, so we knew that Snyk could support all of our technology needs for today, but could they support it going forwards? And that's really where stuff like the support for containers as part of ClearBank's future, we knew that someone like Snyk would score highly on that. The crux of this was around the manual security review check. That was my if you could support the technology. Number two, can you help us remove the manual check? And that's it might sound really easy to say, but there's a lot of subtle parts there, which captures that cultural aspect as well. The great thing about like Snyk, we'll talk about our implementation in a second, but Snyk was really able to give us an identical workflow experience for our developers moving from manual to automated. We'll talk about more of that in a sec. The third part, we're very API first here. Things need to have APIs. We write a lot of API glue. We have a lot of reporting internally, so we have stuff like internal scorecards, reporting capabilities. We needed a partner that had good APIs, good documentation that we could write glue with, nice and easy. And again, Snyk did really, really well for this. Once we're through that, we're really talking about developer experience. So the developers, they're my customers, and we're taking on Snyk, providing it as a product for our customer base. They need to have a good experience. So some of that's around the implementation. Which partner was going to help us implement this as quick and easy with the least cognitive load on our teams. The reporting side of it, how do I make sure that I'm able to demonstrate value to the teams, to the management, to the senior management? How is that journey nice and easy? How am I able to reward the teams that are doing the best? Right, so I need that information out from a potential partner. Speed is always a big thing, right? Pipelines take too long. They all take too long. It's like watching paint dry. We want tools that are fast. So speed was definitely a key criteria. And possibly, a controversial statement, but I'm a believer in is dev experience and the trade-off between speed and completeness of the results. Right, there's no point spending days and days scanning your application if you can't get that feedback while you're doing a pull request. Right, there's no point us generating work items to go in a backlog and forgotten about. Let's get that feedback quick to the developers. Fix advice, again, it's really just that experience, right? It's found a flaw. What do I do about it? And we saw with Snyk with the links out to GitHub. It wasn't just generic advice. We were able to get sort of code samples as well to be able to fix flaws. The administration of the tool, was it easy to configure? There was going to be some toil on my team to look after such a partner. We wanted something as minimal as we can. Again, kind of playing into APIs, with the possibility that we could automate ourselves out of the journey. Results and automatic pull requests for like SCA upgrades, again, was kind of a really nice factor that we had. It's all about cognitive load. How do we make it easy for people to be secure? And if we could find a partner that can meet that, then perfect. And then that last criteria, as is with everybody, is cost. And Snyk were certainly very competitive. And I also really love the transparency in the pricing. This is my biggest bugbear with the security industry at the moment is NDAs for costing. What you feel that people are just making up behind the scenes for costing. But Snyk was very upfront. Everything was included, so it was just you score very high.
We used to have a random number generator, but unfortunately that broke. So these days we've got a very much better way of doing it. I actually really like the way. We're obviously a very dev-focused company, and I think the idea in the majority of our products, really, apart from cloud, which obviously a new product that we're releasing, but the idea of costing per dev, I think it matches what we, our vision in terms of, being a dev tool. But also I think it's also, when you think about what your cost is going to be in 5 years time or 3 years time, and you think about it by devs, it's a much more predictable number that you can probably say, well, I know, we have plans on our people growth, our team growth, our company growth. If I said to you, how many containers are you going to have in 5 years? I mean, wow, you'd have no
Stick
idea,
a finger
right?
in the air, right?
How many servers you have in 5 years? And you don't necessarily want your cost to exponentially grow based on your deployment choices or your environment, right? So I think it makes it much more predictable from your point of view as well, in thinking, what's these costs also going to be in 3-5 years, which is very interesting. So obviously you chose Snyk, and I think you mentioned about the ecosystem. I think you use Azure DevOps, right? And I think, do you use repos as well as the pipeline tool?
Yes, I mean, we use Azure DevOps, I'll be frank, for far too much. So yeah, I mean, why Snyk? I mean, there's a couple of things that were really great. So that native SCM integration with Azure DevOps. When I was going through the initial engagement with Rob, and he told me that we had a customer of a similar estate to us that could be onboarded in a few days, I thought, yeah, right. I'll be frank. I thought, yeah, right. I'm going to spend the next 6 months putting stuff into people's pipelines.
I was going to ask what your expectation was in terms of a rollout. 6 months. Was that historic? That's how long it usually took, or your general finger in the air expectation?
So I knew I had potentially 200 to 300 pipelines that would have to be modified. And although we do some kind of cool stuff around shared templates, it was still going to be significant toil on my team to go with a pipeline-based approach. But when we went through the demos and seeing that SCM integration, the fact we could onboard all of our estate, not just quickly, but without impacting our customers, was golden. Right? It was very cool to see that.
And that's what you did a full onboarding of all your Azure DevOps repos, presumably using the API, using a batch.
Yeah, so the functionality within the portal to do that batch import was very good. When we first brought Snyk on, yes, within a day we were able to get the full analytics of our estate, that full pulse check across the estate. Now, perhaps being too honest, we made a bit of a mistake with that. I blame myself. So because from our customer perspective, they have immediately got overwhelmed by far too many results. All of our customers were assigned to every single repo, lots of them that they didn't support, and there was a bit of noise there. From my perspective, being able to demonstrate immediate value from Snyk, it was a very good exercise, but we did have to rapidly adjust our approach on that one. Again, coming back to the Snyk APIs though, so we have an internal API, what teams own what repositories. We were able to write a bit of glue quite quickly to do that kind of automated onboarding, give the teams their own organization just for their repos, just notifications to their own stuff. So that was, yes, I'm glad our choice of going for a strong API worked out for us in the end there.
Yeah, and I think that's really valuable. I mean, one part of any dev first tool is really having an API, having that extensibility and being flexible enough to, oh, you want to do that? And it isn't supported, or maybe too big a job to do through an API, too cumbersome if it's lots of projects, then a scripting of our API or even CLI is very, very valuable. And I think, so in terms of, let's dig a little bit deeper into that, because I think that's an interesting one. So in terms of when you added all the repositories in, was there any workflow changes to the developers, or did you do it in such a way whereby it was more visibility only?
It was visibility only.
Okay.
And it was very exciting to be able to run that kind of exercise really with our customers completely unaware. Right? We could have onboarded Snyk, got that initial pulse check. We brought the devs on the journey. They were part of all of this anyway to help with that cultural change management. But if we really wanted to, yes, we could have done that completely isolated with zero cognitive load on the teams to get that pulse check, which is really powerful. The second part, icing on the cake, was the time at which Snyk provides the feedbacks to developers as well. So one bit of magic onboarding things quickly, but the second bit of magic there is choosing to give the feedback as part of the status check on the pull request, which is it's a natural delay in the development process, right? I've written my code, I've pushed it up, I'm waiting for a peer to review it. There's a natural delay. I've got no expectation that my peer is going to review it immediately. And that's the time where Snyk is doing its thing, it's scanning, it's giving some feedback. I personally was very excited to see that. I thought, wow, what a great time to get some feedback. Someone hasn't waited 20 minutes for a pipeline to get that feedback. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, when you were getting that feedback, obviously it was because it's being done in a very different place. I think like you said before, where tools that almost like provide huge reports with thousands and thousands of issues can very much overwhelm development groups when just provided with this list of to-dos. Because this was subtly different to how you've done it before, what was the reaction of the dev teams in terms of their engagement with these results, or what did you need to do in terms of getting the devs on board with these, the results and the understanding of what the to-dos were?
Yeah, for sure. So from like a workflow perspective, there was really very little change. Our developers were used to making pull requests. We had this manual security reviewer, which also occurred during the pull request stage. So from kind of a workflow perspective, there was very little difference, right? It's just all of a sudden, this person is now being aided by this automated tool that's injecting itself. They didn't have to go to another portal, they didn't have to change a pipeline. That was very cool. No workflow changes. In terms of actually actioning, and doing stuff with the advice, well, so we have security champions, so we made sure that they had the training. They knew this tool was coming. The developers that were part of the sales process as well were our initial fan base, so they could help get that embedded into their own teams, which was fantastic. But the other really selling point for Snyk was that configurability of how severe the feedback could be in the pull request. So what we were able to do really is have it as an optional check for a couple of months. So it was there kind of providing that automated feedback. And we gave people the choice that you don't have to deal with this right now. I know that it's new feedback. You might not understand everything it's telling you. So we were able to go through that period where it just wasn't blocking the pull request. It was just there for people to get used to. And then once teams were on top of their flaws a bit more, we could start to tighten that control. So we could start to say, okay, now we're going to block on any new critical things that have been introduced, for example. And that kind of been able to gradually turn the key, the strength of that control has gone down pretty well.
And so this was, you're presumably referring to like a Snyk policy for this to be able to do this. And your focus there then, to dig a little bit deeper into that, once you've done the full visibility check, you're going to have a number of existing vulnerabilities. With the Azure DevOps repos integration, so you can test on pull requests, how did you balance developers producing secure code? In other words, the future development feature branches, etc., that they're doing. How did you balance this developers securing that code versus looking at the backlog? Did you do them both at the same time, or did you focus more on the initial code that developers are writing? What was your approach?
That's a great question. So I guess part of bringing in one of these tools was, I think the phrase "stem the bleeding" as well. What's been used before. It's a bit of a vicious phrase, but once people were getting once people were getting that feedback, they're getting that feedback with the pull request. I think we naturally felt that the number of flaws, it wasn't increasing, right? Really from the get-go, people were dealing with the flaws that were found in the code they were changing. Tackling the legacy flaws, I mean, that's always another challenge, right? Because sometimes we're talking about code bases that have no ownership or haven't been touched in 5 or 6 years. That's always challenging. So what we did with that is really around the reporting and trying to gamify, another very popular term, but how do we get that legacy information visible to everybody? So whether that's through reporting, so we do kind of monthly reporting for all the teams. This is how your legacy flaw count is going. Is it going the right way? These are your improvements. How do we reward the teams that are getting on top of their flaws? I can show some slides in a bit about how our scoring mechanism works. But very much the legacy was a case of making it visible, right? It's not hidden anymore. It's in our reports. These reports go to management. What we tried to then do was tie, I said, going back to our original goal here, which was about removing that manual security reviewer check. How do we tie those things together, right? That removing that manual check is going to help this team go faster. There's a bit of negotiation we can do here. Get on top of your legacy flaws, and then we can start peeling away some of those manual reviewer checks. There's a bit of a reward for getting on top of your estate. Now you can have this automated reviewer. So it's just some of the approaches.
Yeah, interesting. I like the idea of to stop the bleed, I guess, first, because it depending on the maturity almost of the security or DevSecOps maturity of teams, it's about sometimes finding what the smallest lift is, what the smallest change that you can make. And I think a couple of things that are really important is that context and the relevance to the developer. So if a developer is just working on some code, the context is super strong for that developer to look at that code. And the ownership is obviously there because they're the person who just raised that pull request. So in terms of a developer looking at the security of that, it's way more relevant than potentially a very, an important backlog issue that may just be in some shared code that they have never touched or maybe touched a couple of times. It really, to create that, to build up that muscle memory of secure development, it's a far easier place to start, I think. And I think that's a common way that we've seen a lot of customers actually, build out their programs and get developers on. It also fits very well with the kind of the Azure DevOps and repos integrations that you mentioned. And actually, while on that, you mentioned you have hundreds of pipelines, presumably fewer Azure DevOps repos. Why did you start with the SCM testing versus perhaps pipeline testing or something like that? Was there a reason you gravitated to that first?
I think it really good. Our team care very much about our customers and not impacting our customers. And really, we feel that our job, unless we can take a security challenge away completely, it's really our job to make it as easy as we can for our developers. So that was the crux of it. That SCM integration, it was out of band, right? It was something we could do. We could onboard it on behalf of the teams. We weren't asking the teams for time to go and modify their own pipelines. We could just do that, right? We could just do it for them. So which was great. But again, just going back to the pipelines, like all pipelines, they just take too long. And to have that delay, because you end up, I'm sure you're the same. You're watching that pipeline and it's stopping your job, you're stopping your release, you're watching it. And it just doesn't feel like a great place of feedback, if I'm honest.
Yeah, and there's a bigger delay there, I guess, in that feedback in terms of seeing something potentially an hour later versus as soon as you send the pull request and you're still working on it. Yeah. So in terms of your developers, then obviously your developers were a big part of the decision to go with Snyk as well. What was their reaction to, I guess, part of that onboarding? So when you started introducing workflow changes to your developers, did they largely accept it? Were there any pushbacks? Was it pockets of teams, or how did that go?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, so largely because we've been able to do almost a like for like workflow. So we've got that manual check in the pull request. We've replaced it with automated checks. Honestly, I couldn't have wished for a better scenario where we've not had to change how developers work. Which has massively reduced the friction that we've found. Also, that we could do a lot of the legwork on behalf of the teams. We're not fighting for backlog time to get this implemented. Again, that's a common point of frustration, right? Where you've got to fight for a bit of backlog time. We just didn't have to do it, which was great. I think, I'll be honest and empathetically, that we've got teams who look after older estate, larger estate, back when decisions were made near the start of the existence of the bank. And sure, we're fleshing some wounds that people wouldn't have known about. Okay, but it's not their fault, right? This tool is telling them their estate suddenly has hundreds of critical flaws. I have a lot of empathy why they might be upset with that, but it's not really down to, it's not their fault, it's not anybody's fault, it's just old code that's not been maintained. And Snyk is really there just to help us flesh that out, right? Just to make it visible and to then be able to fight for the backlog time, right? We've suddenly got some data, we've suddenly got some evidence. Oh, this part of the estate, it's not been touched, it needs a bit of care. Now I've got the proof, right? And it's much easier for me to go to product owners and senior management and go, look, you've got X amount of critical flaws that are out of date. So all that kind of how do we help developers fight for the time to improve the quality of the products? Well, Snyk played a pretty damn good part in that.
And presumably as well for developers to actually see the impact that they're making as well, right? So to be able to see, by doing these things, I'm creating a posture, I'm improving the posture significantly of our app, or reducing the risk significantly of our app.
For sure, and I get developers that will ping me to say, look, I've just taken 20 Snyk critical flaws off this product. I think, well, that's awesome. Good for you. And now I can do some internal reward scheme for you as well. That sense of achievement, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so from the security point of view, then you've already mentioned kind of like the policies. How did you know when to adjust the policies? How did you? And I guess was that done with the development teams or feedback from the development teams? How did you go about that guardrail approach?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So we work very closely with dev teams, and obviously we know that some of our teams are, I think mature is the wrong word, but we have teams who are working on fresher, newer things, and other teams who are working on older things. I think it's more a case of just trying to be empathetic, but we try to give the dev teams the choice. Like we give them some criteria to meet. So get your flaws down to X% or X ratio for your domain, and then you can choose to start tightening it up. There's certainly no hardline policies from our team. Team by team basis with options, you meet this criteria, you can start to get the better options.
Yeah, and I guess some like you say, maybe some of the teams that are, I don't want to say more legacy, but don't want to necessarily use some of the newer processes, are probably sticking with CI, maybe testing in CI, maybe a little bit of STM. Do you go as far left as locally testing in build tools or IDE testing? How do some of the more early adopters take to Snyk?
Yeah, for sure. So IDE integration is a really interesting one, and I'll be honest, until using the Snyk tool, I've always considered IDE integration a bit of a gimmick. It's been that kind of that golden thing that SaaS tools want to get to, where you get that immediate feed, type in code, and it's immediately giving you some intelligence about how to fix it. But my experience is up until Snyk, it's a bit like having a spell check that delays on you, right? You're trying to write a Word document, and it's suddenly delaying for a couple of seconds before it tells you spelled something wrong. Well, I turn that off, and I don't blame anyone for turning it off. But with Snyk, it's generally a fast tool, right? There was no burden on it. You were spotting flaws very quickly, giving the feedback, weren't lagging the Visual Studio as we have here. So teams are, it's the only place where I've actually had people want to use the IDE tools. I knew from the get-go that I was never going to mandate IDE tools. These things are a gimmick, but people actually wanted to use it because it's a better experience for them. They don't have to log into the portal, which is fine. They get the feedback in the IDE, and it's not messing with their flow. So I think you've done a good job with the IDE
you have
tool.
devs coming to you asking to use Snyk in the IDE. Right.
Yeah,
which is from your point of view, the golden place to be, like the ideal provider to be, right? With devs asking to use the security tool.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. And so let's switch to results quickly. We have probably about 5, 6, 7 minutes left. Let's move over to results. I think you mentioned a graph or burn down that you were talking about. What was the impact that, I guess, this developer adoption or this new testing in process, what did they actually achieve? What was the impact?
Yeah, Simon, I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to try and share just some of our success with Snyk. I say it's really the success of our engineering teams. Really, are we able to see that one?
Yep, you can see that.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is brilliant, right? This is where I want to be when I'm rolling out a tool such as this. At the start, back in January, when we were really starting to embed Snyk, we had a lot of critical flaws across the estate. Every company is going to have a lot of critical flaws. Bearing in mind this is the first time we've ever had one of these SaaS tools come into play. And really through reporting, through being available, through tweaking the experience of Snyk where we can. So I mentioned there about having teams give them their own organization, they're not overwhelmed by flaws, but rewarding teams, like being able to call out the teams who have done the best. We have internal reward schemes that we can go and say thank you to people who are getting on top of this stuff. It's just been this great success story. We wanted to burn down the amount of flaws we had by 80% through the year. And it's not me, it's the dev teams. They have burned this down very, very well. We're well ahead of progress. And this is down to tool adoption. I can't. There's no more powerful graph I could show you, Simon. That this is adoption, right? This is people taking on the tools. Fantastic.
No, this is incredible, and this is the number here on the left is obviously flaws per project, but obviously as the number of projects goes into the hundreds, you're looking at those kind of similar numbers in terms of criticals. We won't go into numbers at all, but this is on the left hand side here. This is number of criticals per project, right?
Yeah, correct. So we use ratios, try to use ratios where we can. So one of the challenges that I didn't want to get to in a tool with Snyk is by tracking absolute values. So going like January, I had 500, February, I had 500, March, I had 400. ClearBank is growing, like it's always growing. We've got more people, more code. And when you see a graph, that's that example. If I said January, February, March, we had 500 every month. Yeah, but the amount of code that we have, the amount of products that we have has actually increased in that time. I can't show the success. With absolute figures, right? Because what we're actually saying is all that new code didn't have any flaws in it.
Yeah.
But when using something like ratios, I can actually say, well, even though the estate expanded through this time, the amount of flaws to product has come down, which is fantastic.
Which is amazing because and this is like what, just around 6 months, just over 6 months. So in 6 months, not just reducing the number of issues that are coming in, criticals that are coming in, but actually reducing the total number by around 2/3 by the look of it, which is incredible. Yeah.
So
cool.
Very, very happy with that.
Sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, and all this kind of feeds into, we like to run experiments. As a team, we run experiments. I appreciate how important reporting, feedback, celebrating success is to getting good security cultures within the team. So we find, I know it's kind of an awful screen here, but just for those on the call, we try to feed those ratios to give teams their own scores. And those scores are kind of tied to the size of their estate, how much stuff they're looking after. We thought it's quite a fair way to give people a score. And, so this kind of experiments that we're running around scoring has been going really well. So I definitely encourage anyone on the call, think about how you can show which teams are the best and make sure you're thanking them.
And this is visible and transparent across teams, or only to management, or is across all teams?
Everybody, across teams. Everybody gets to see these.
Amazing. There's an amount of gamification, I guess. Amount of gamification in there. And let's talk a little bit about adoption, actually. What are some of the techniques? You talked a little bit about celebrating success, I guess, in terms of rewards and those kind of things. What were some of the most effective techniques that you've seen in terms of really helping to build that adoption inorganically, as well as people just wanting to use the product?
I think over communicating is probably, if there's one thing to take away, it's about over communication. There's no such thing as over communication really in remote working environment, but just being constantly present. So most of those, like yourselves and those on the call, you're going to have things like all hands, where once a week all your engineering teams come together, and there's usually talks by management or giving updates. as AppSec, ProdSec professionals, you need to be you need to take advantage of these platforms and make sure that you're visibly promoting the value of these tools and the improvements that the organization is making. So get on these forums, these all hands, anything where you can talk, show some slides, do a bit of presentation, and do it regularly, right? Not just once a quarter. Me and my team, we're presenting every week at these kind of things to try and make sure that security is mentioned, that we're showing stats. But again, using different channels, so Teams and emails. Don't just assume that all of your target audience is just using one channel. You have to use all of them. So communicating and constantly, and just being transparent, being accessible, answering questions, and almost just have empathy, right? You're trying to change how people work, especially developers who have a lot of control over how they work, their laptops, the permissions they have, their environments. Yeah, remember, this is their products, their environments. You're trying to influence it. So you need to do that with respect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think actually we're just coming up to the end, so I'll ask if anyone, the quick chat's been a little bit quiet, but if there's anyone who has any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat. We can take them in just a second. I'd love to actually just touch on one thing. You mentioned about that transparency. In terms of the transparency, was gamification, do you feel, a big aspect to teams not wanting to be the worst, or teams wanting to kind of like move up the board? And some developers like this, some developers don't, so it's not always going to be the kind of like silver bullet. But do you feel gamification helped you in any way during this?
I 100%. And it's not really, I try not to focus on the teams where, the ones who are at the bottom. It's more about being able to reward the teams at the top, the ones that are taking it seriously. How do we make sure that they're getting visibility and promotion? Yes, of course, as soon as we start ranking people, they're going to be at people at the bottom, but they're not the worst. They are the people that need the help, right? We reward the people at the top. We go and speak to the people at the bottom and help.
Yeah, it's good. The no blame style of, okay, we're here to help. How can we join you and help you to improve? Yeah, I love that style. We've got a question from Rich. Good to see you again, Rich. What's the one thing you did that you regret or wish you done differently with the rollout of Snyk to your teams?
So I should have listened to Stanley, who was our pre-sales engineer, going back to that idea of don't onboard all your repositories into one organization. Now, I'll be honest, I was in a rush. I needed a pulse check across the estate. But we did overwhelm our teams, really. Their first kind of interaction with Snyk ended up being a lot of noise, a lot of notifications about stuff, repositories that weren't their repositories. And a lot of them just turned it off, right? They turned off those notifications as anyone would. Could I go back to the start? We would have gone for the team-based organization from the start. I'd have done that complete onboarding. I'd have done completely isolated just to the InfoSec teams. Try and made none of the engineering teams aware of that, and really just have their first experience of Snyk as just their stuff. One for next time.
How would you have done that? One org per team?
One org per team.
One org per team, okay. And then perhaps one top org with everything which is zero noise, purely from a InfoSec reporting and risk.
Yeah. Okay, 100%.
And then every team would presumably then be a member of the one team they're in.
Correct. Just their organization.
Their projects, and of course you can add different people to different organizations if that's what they want, and they into those as well. Yeah, great question, Rich. And I guess to go further into that question, in terms of the rollout, is there anything you did that you feel slowed you down as part of the not the initial rollout, but over time? Do you feel that there's anything that could have made you go faster, or maybe something slowed you down? Anything from whether it's tooling or application, or maybe something in the Security Champions program? What do you feel were your blockers or your bottlenecks?
You know what? If anything, I think we went at the right speed. Although the tools enable very quick onboarding, and everyone wants to get their projects delivered quickly, you have to respect that cultural change piece, and that takes time. And everybody is going on their little journey of acceptance at their own speed. So while yes, there's things that we could have done to have made it faster. Honestly, I wouldn't have chosen to. Some people need to go at their speed to accept the tool.
It goes back to that. What we started with, culture changes happen at the speed they need to happen at, and you need to adjust your processes and your tools to support the speed at which you want to go at.
100%.
Which is your culture change. Yeah, amazing. Cool. If there's any other questions, feel free. I've got one last one for you, which is, I guess, what advice, maybe the opposite of what Rich was asking there, rather than what do you regret? What advice would you give to anyone who's going on a similar AppSec journey to yourself? What do you think was the, and not, don't say Snyk here, like just general advice, I guess. We'll take Snyk as a given. General advice in terms of what was the key thing that you look at and you think, you know what, that was the moment, or that was the thing that we did, which was core to our success.
It was bringing the developers on the journey with us, getting them on the sales call with us, part of the proof of concepts, right? This having your end users part of the journey with you, building that fan base to start with, people who can buy into the tool and take it back to their teams. That's critical. I mean, that's DevSecOps, right? That we're all working together to try and achieve this. Like no one sets out to build insecure code. I've never met anybody who sets out to do that. I've met lots of people who don't have much time. That's the problem. But we can bring developers on the journey. They can see that these tools are there to save them time, to reduce their cognitive load.
Well, great answer. I think it's that collaboration, I think, is absolutely core. I totally agree with you. And I think one of the ways in which I've heard this described well, as in addition to that, is to talk about shared goals, and having dev and sec have shared goals where security is helping the devs to achieve those goals, and really a lot of the decisions that need to be made somewhat is development decisions that's supported by security. And I think particularly when it comes down to tooling and things like that, having the developers use, adopt, roll out, actually be bought into a tool they want to use is really important to get their buy-in. So yeah, no, I really agree with that sentiment. Well, Seb, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. First of all, thank you for the time. Thank you for sharing your experiences, and I hope many on the call will have found some value. I'm sure they will have into your insights. I love the partnership that we have with ClearBank, and I'm really looking forward to continue working with you. But yeah, thank you very, very much. And for those who missed the start, this is a recorded session, so if you did miss the start, we will be sending out this recorded link to you afterwards. Thank you very, very much both to Seb and everyone who is on the call for joining, and have a great rest of your days. Thank you.
Brilliant.